Good morning, Lena, Yuri. Good morning, everybody from the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. It is really an emotional moment also for me to be able to participate in this forum, but I think it's also an important participation for the Council of Europe because it has been with the school that was set up by Lena and Yuri in Moscow that we started that, I think, important and fascinating journey in partnership in education for democracy, education, civic education, based on the conviction that we have here in the Council of Europe that for a functioning democracy, you do not only need institutions, of course you do, but you also need a democratic environment with citizens which have skills and knowledge and ambition and motivation and opportunities to engage in democracy as active citizens. And that journey that started with the school set up by Lena and Yuri has now expanded to more than 20 schools in different countries. And it's a part of a much broader program that we have in the Council of Europe to achieve these objectives, which I find are crucial really for the functioning of our democracies based on the Council of Europe principles of embodied in the European Convention of Human Rights. This year's forum is devoted to the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and I think that's a very, very important milestone, of course. But it also made me think of other anniversaries, because it's always important to look back to understand the world that we see around us today. We're also celebrating in this year, and you will forgive me to bring in the Council of Europe angle, the 70th anniversary of the Council of Europe, European Convention of Human Rights. And we have also marked in the beginning of this year the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau that was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in January 1945. And I think it's important sometimes to go back and understand how these things were connected, to understand where was that universalism coming from. Perhaps it will help us to understand how we lost some of it on the way. So if you indulge me, I'll devote my few minutes this morning here today with a little story about the past. Because the events that we are marking today, both the creation of the United Nations in its most important legal acts, but then the Council of Europe and the European Convention of Human Rights that was created in 1970, are of course very much related to what happened in the Second World War, but even more so what happened before the Second World War, in the events, in that gradual descent into inhumanity that we have seen in the 1930s. And we often say, of course, we all say that the European project, the multilateral global system based on the respect of international law was a response to the Second World War. But we treat it, I don't think we really try to understand it in details, how direct, how important, and how pragmatic that response was. It was not just some sort of ethical aspiration. We were so bad before, let's now try to be better. When we look at the European Convention of Human Rights, actually, it's a direct legal consequence, very practical, very pragmatic, very down-to-earth consequence and continuation of what has happened in the 1930s, and then what happened in the war and what happened in the Nuremberg trials. And that's what my story is about, because I think it's very important to understand the importance of the European Convention and the importance of human rights, why we have them. Now, from today's perspective, the Nuremberg trials, they seem as a logical epilogue of what we have seen during the most horrifying period of European history. But in 1946, when the trials took place, that was far from obvious. simply because at the time international law did not provide any clear rules or principles allowing for an international trial of state leaders and military commanders for crimes committed against their own nationals in accordance with applicable national law. In other words, the Allies had a problem because they had no clear basis in international law to prosecute those accountable for the Holocaust. This predicament also produced the famous Nuremberg defense, in which defendants argued that they could not be held criminally liable because they had only obeyed the laws and followed orders. And that defense did not work in Nuremberg, but it did work in some other trials of Nazi criminals. So when the Allies met, I think it was in Yalta in 1945, they were discussing this problem that they had, actually. And I think Winston Churchill was most pragmatic, and he just said they should all be lined up the nearest wall and shot. And the Americans were insisting that there would be a legal process. And Joseph Stalin, always eager to please, he said he could go either way. But finally, the Americans prevailed, and we actually had a legal process. And in August 1945, the Allies adopted a London Charter introducing into international law a previously unknown category of crime against humanity. And that was a huge milestone, because for the first time in history, there was a basis to hold the high state representatives, government officials, and military commanders criminally responsible for acts committed during the war or in peacetime against any civilian population, regardless of whether the defendants acted under the applicable national legislation. The London Charter's few sentences did not only provide the legal basis for the prosecution of those responsible for the Holocaust, but also laid the foundation for a new international order protecting the rights and freedoms of individuals against the abuse of power by their own state. In 1948, this new legal order was codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and 2 years later in the European Convention of Human Rights, also establishing an international human rights court in Strasbourg. Both the Universal Charter and the European Convention of Human Rights go beyond the mere prohibition of crimes against humanity. After experiencing the horror of Nazism, the Western Allies were determined not to wait and sanction a future Holocaust after it had been committed, but rather to do everything within their power to prevent it from happening in the first place. So what happened is really that the authors of the European Convention of Human Rights, which were mostly British lawyers, actually, they disassembled the Holocaust. They looked into every step on that gradual descent into inhumanity during the 30s. They disassembled the Holocaust into its constituent components, and then they designed corresponding safeguards to prevent Europe from ever redescending into inhumanity and state-sponsored crime. Every article of the European Convention of Human Rights is based in something that happened, is there to prevent something like this happening ever again. The prohibition of discrimination and the guarantees of freedom of assembly, association, and speech are a reaction to the legal persecution of the Jews, their banning from public life and the exercise of public life, as well as to the persecution of political opponents, dissenting intellectuals, trade unionists, and critical media, or Lügenpresse, as the Nazis called fake news media. The right to marry, respect for private and family life, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion constitute a safeguard against new Kristallnachts, or Nuremberg laws, which introduced the biological segregation of Jews in 1935, and together with other laws, ultimately dehumanized the Jewish people and deprived them of all their rights. The right to a fair trial and the right to liberty and security were dictated by the memory of the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Courts, for the enemies of the people, which, in the name of the nation, condemned thousands of people to death and served as a tool for the suppression of justice, humanity, and freedom. The ban on slavery, forced labor, and torture, and the right to life are the response to the concentration camps. the final solution, and the murder of more than 6 million Jews, as well as Roma, homosexuals, political opponents, Soviet soldiers, and members of inferior nations. This is why and how we got the international protection of human rights. The European Convention of Human Rights is not the result of some lofty philosophical or religious aspirations. It is a direct response to a horrible historical experience. For the statesman after the Second World War, never again was not just a platitude to be uttered once or twice a year with a mimicked determination. 70 years on, we have more and more people who, be it from conviction, opportunism, or ethical and intellectual limitations, more and more openly undermine international standards, obligations, and mechanisms for the protection of human rights. Public opinion increasingly sees human rights as an undeserved and socially disruptive privilege, profiting unworthy minorities to the detriment of the majority, rather than the protection of individuals against the abuse of power by the state. This is not extremely stupid and unjust, but also very dangerous. After the war, the human rights protection system was set up to protect Europe from a resurgence of violent nationalism. Today, many are trying to protect nationalism from human rights. I think it's important we recall why we have all these international instruments. I think it's even more important to recall that today in the Europe we live in. And I think the question I will leave you with at the beginning, the question sometimes I'm almost worried to ask, but I think it needs to be asked again and again, is that whether the statesmen of today would have determination, courage, and responsibility to agree to a European Convention of Human Rights and to a European Code of Human Rights if we did not have one in the first place. Thank you very much, and really all the best, and I wish you a very, very challenging, interesting forum. Thank you. And again, greetings from Strasbourg, from the Council of Europe in Strasbourg.